The most important context for Claude McKay's 1922 poem was the Harlem Renaissance, a period of artistic and cultural flowering among African Americans in Upper Manhattan. And we're going to talk a lot more about the Harlem Renaissance later in the course. But for now, it's important to think about four major events that contribute to, that set up the Harlem Renaissance and frame the experience of African Americans in America at this time. The first thing to remember is that Jim Crow reigns in the South. It is a segregated land where African Americans are disenfranchised politically, socially, and economically. During this period from 89 to 1918, we know that at least 2,500 lynchings of African Americans occurred, and research recently released suggests that number might be as much as a third higher than that. As a result of all those patterns, what we know is the Great Migration of African Americans from the South up into the Midwest and North occurs during the same period as the Harlem Renaissance. In the middle of all that, World War I takes place, and African Americans play a role in that war. They come back to New York, triumphant warriors, patriots who've served their country, and march in a parade in New York City. And they come back, of course, with a new sense of the injustice of racial discrimination in America after spending time particularly in much more open-minded and racially open France. Upon their return from World War I, African American veterans and African Americans throughout the country experienced a bitter summer in 1919 when dozens and dozens of American cities experienced race riots that resulted in the death of at least hundreds of African Americans. And again, historical record is unclear, could have been significantly more than that. So there's this experience in early 20th century America of horrible, aggressive, violent racism against the backdrop of service and patriotism by African Americans in the war. And as you can imagine, that creates mixed feelings, ambivalence, a sense of a commitment to America as a country, and a sense of outrage with America as a country. And that's exactly the ambivalence that we found and discussed in the poem during the earlier video. Ambivalence is a cool word. It doesn't mean neutral. It means ambivalent. It means feelings on multiple sides, or particularly two sides of a question. So someone like Claude McKay can be simultaneously outraged with what's happening in America and love America and be thrilled by the possibilities that it offers. Here's an interesting quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who emerges in the early 20th century as the leading African-American intellectual, especially of the early civil rights movement of this period. And he writes, "We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don, to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing, 'This country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting.'" Just a really cool quote. We're going to talk about the power of singing in American literature, the power of the word to sing and singing in American literature later this week. Du Bois is participating in a poetic trope that has its strongest manifestation in the poetry of Walt Whitman. And Langston Hughes and other African-American poets of the early 20th century are going to pick up on it. So it's fascinating that the language of song appears here in the literature of a prose writer like Du Bois as well. Anyway, that little digression aside, you can see that having a specific knowledge of the context of the poem we've been studying significantly adds to our ability to validate our interpretation. In other words, interpretation is a combination of unpacking the language of a poem, of unpacking how a literary device creates meaning, and contextualizing it with the historical events of a period.